Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name's Greg Williams, and I'm the host for tonight. And I'm also the director of UMBC's Instructional Systems Development Program. All right, so let me make this segue to introducing Dr. Paul Elliot, our speaker. Paul H. Elliot is the president and founder of Exemplary Performance, LLC, based in Annapolis. Dr. Elliot has extensive experience with enterprise clients in the area of strategy development and execution, human capital strategy, in support of enterprise-wide business initiatives, and optimization of talent to drive business results. Since the late 1990s, Paul has supported Microsoft in defining and applying techniques for optimizing individual and team performance. Much of his work has been focused through Microsoft's Role Excellence Initiative. Additionally, other clients have included BP, ExxonMobil, Agilent, FedEx, JP Morgan Chase, AstraZeneca, GM, Ford, Chrysler, and other global companies. He's co-authored a book on human capital strategy entitled Exemplary Performance, Driving Business Results by Benchmarking Your Star Performers, published by Josie Bass. Publication was awarded the International Society Performance Improvement 2014 Award of Excellence for Outstanding Performance Improvement publication. Dr. Elliot's expertise is in the analysis of human performance and the design of interventions that optimize human performance in support of strategy. Dr. Elliot assists organizations in performance analysis, product and process launch support, and the design and implementation of integrated performance system. Paul has served on the board of directors for ASTD from 93 to 95. He also served on ADD's executive in residence, 95 and 96, when he crafted their strategy and approach to performance improvement. Dr. Elliot received his PhD in educational psychology from the University of Illinois and his BA from Rutgers. You also got your master's from Syracuse too, right? Okay, go Orangemen. Yes. All right. Additional publications include chapters in the AST Handbook, definitive reference for training and development, entitled Linking Learning to Performance. Paul also co-authored an article entitled Helping Every Team Exceed Expectations. Dr. Elliot also wrote a chapter in assessment, moving to training and performance. I think you get the picture. He's a very experienced guy. We're lucky to have him here tonight. Paul, it's all yours.
Well, it's good to be with you. I'm hoping this mic's on and that one's off so we don't get any feedback. He mentioned Rutgers. I did my undergraduate in psych, and I had this fascination with human learning and adults. And I had this belief that if we came up with better, more effective, and more efficient ways of getting information into people's heads, that would correlate with higher performance for those audiences. And so when I had the opportunity to continue my education, I went to Syracuse, got a master's from an instructional technology group. I jokingly say I got it posthumously because I went there in a fellowship program for my PhD and decided to leave halfway through and go to the University of Illinois. I had never applied for the master's program, and a year after I left, I got one in the mail unexpectedly. So somehow somebody made a decision to do that. I want tonight to be very audience-centric. So I certainly have things I'd like to say, but I'd like to leave as much of the control up to you as I can. And so to start off with that, I think we all like to vote, right? So there's this long-standing debate about how to start off a presentation. Some people say you should always start off with humor, and others say you ought to get right into the meat of the subject. So in order to be audience-centric, anybody who would like me to start off with a joke, raise your hand.
I want to joke about the depth of the content. I
That would be a little bit of a challenge, perhaps. Well, I won't even ask how many don't want to joke because the eyes already have it. So this story is told, these two guys are out walking their dogs. One has a German Shepherd, the other has a Chihuahua. They've been walking for about an hour. The one guy says, the guy with the German Shepherd, he said, I am famished. Let's stop and get some lunch. And the guy with the Chihuahua, who's kind of the wiser of the two, says, the restaurant won't let us in with our pets. The guy with the German Shepherd says, watch this. Pulls out a pair of really dark glasses, puts the German Shepherd on point, walks up to the restaurant. The maitre d' comes out and says, sir, could I help you? He said, yes, I'd like to get some lunch. We're not allowed in this city to have a pet in the restaurant. The guy says, oh, this is my seeing eye dog. Oh, no problem. So he gets him a table. The guy with the Chihuahua's back a block watching this. He pulls out a pair of really dark glasses. He puts the Chihuahua on point and walks up to the restaurant. Maitre d' comes out, sir, can I help you? He says, yes, I'd like to get some lunch. I'm sorry, we're not allowed to seat you with your pet. He said, this is my seeing eye dog. The maitre d's astounded. He said, I had no idea they use Chihuahuas as seeing eye dogs. The guy said, they gave me a Chihuahua? Okay, so we'll get into more serious. You voted for it. You voted for it. So, okay. So I want to start off, and basically here's the outline of what we're going to try and cover, provide some context and some definition, talk a little bit about systems thinking, talk about how big the opportunity is when you look at elevating the performance of roles and teams in organizations, where obviously training in ISD is a critical part. Then talk a little bit about where to get the best data and how to use that for design, and then how that can be applied to training in ISD. So the rules of engagement, keeping that theme of being audience-centric. If there are questions, we're going to have a Q&A at the end, but as long as we don't turn into 24/7 news and talk over each other, but if we can raise questions during the middle of the presentation, I'm comfortable with that. So somehow indicate you have a question, stand up, yell, whatever, and we'll go from there. Just remind me to repeat the question so that I'm not answering a question that none of the rest of you have heard, which is kind of annoying at times. So, the challenge, we always want to have objectives, and they could be learning objectives, they could be behavioral objectives. I would like this to be a cognitive objective. I'd just like you to think about things differently by the end of the presentation. I don't expect the information to be radically new. Hopefully it's applied in a little bit different way. So I'd like you to be thinking about how you define success for the training organizations of which you're a part or from which you benefit. And then also think about some of the ideas as they're shared, how they may impact your own career trajectory. So the rate at which things are changing is astounding. We've pretty much topped out Moore's Law. There is now a chip with more transistors than there are people in the world. Just over 7 billion transistors on a single chip. And quantum physics is kind of limiting the ability to take that further. Atoms are starting to jump between the channels in the chip because it's so dense, okay? At the same time, there are two other laws, the names of which escape me. The rate at which data is transferring is still doubling every I think it's every 6 months. And the rate at which software is evolving is also like a hockey stick, going up faster and faster and faster. So we have to be prepared for this unbelievable time of change. And I thought I'd share a couple of stories, not stories, examples of things that are going on that you may or may not be aware of. First, a company in Baltimore called Catalyte. Any of you heard of Catalyte? I know Greg had heard a little bit about it. If you watch 60 Minutes 2 Sundays ago, they were on there as part of another story. They didn't have a whole 20-minute segment, but they were mentioned. They have an assessment tool that they give to anybody who wants to take it, who identifies the capability of people to become highly capable software developers. And they refuse to look at anybody's resume. They don't care what education you have. They don't care what technology background you have. They care about the assessment only. And if you score well on the assessment, they'll put you through 20 weeks of training. If you go through that training well, you'll go into a 2-year apprenticeship. And here's some data. The average salary of someone taking the assessment is about $23,000 a year. They could be GED students, they could come from West Baltimore, they could come from Harvard. They could be fine arts graduates or never darken the door of a higher institution of higher education. Average salary, $23,000. At the end of the 2-year apprenticeship, it's in the low 60s. 2 years after that, it's in the mid-90s. So it's opening up the door to people with capability regardless of resume. And by resume, I don't mean the paper, I mean your history, right? It's just fascinating. I think we're going to be seeing that all over the place. Now, hopefully not for medical professionals and certain others. I think the School of Nursing is safe. But there are so many things where we close people off from opportunity on totally arbitrary and capricious measures. And I think we're going to see this massive movement toward more meritocracy in terms of opportunity. In fact, the founder of this was an economist from Harvard, and the basic premise of the company is talent is evenly distributed and opportunity isn't. And that shouldn't be acceptable, right? Another thing, and Greg alluded to this very briefly, I've been working with Microsoft for a long time, 20 years as a consultant, never an employee. And they have something called Rolex, which means role excellence. They are individuals, there are several hundred of them in the company, each assigned to a particular role, and they own the progress and elevation of that role over time. They're neither training nor HR, they're in the operating groups. They broker services from training, from the compensation group, from HR for hiring, with the process improvement group for building tools. But they're in operations and have full responsibility for helping members of that particular profession around the globe perform at a higher level. The interesting thing there, in my opinion, is things that traditionally fell into certain audiences, like the ones represented in this room, are being moved into the operating groups where it's closer to the audiences that they want to serve. There's a colleague of mine, a friend, down in Severna Park who has a company called Learning ROI. How many of you believe learning agility is essential to success in many professions? That makes sense? What he's doing is looking at tools, online tools, to actually elevate the ability of people to learn rapidly within various and sundry settings. So I'm doing a project. In fact, I'm working with Catalyte a week or two a month, helping them on their program. And one of the things I'm finding with software development, learning agility is like the probably critical differentiator between people who succeed and don't in that particular environment. Because it used to be, you'd learn a tool. If you're old enough, like I am, the first software tool I learned after machine language was COBOL, right? You'd learn a tool, and if you knew that tool, it was going to serve you well for a long period of time. Now it's a matter of months, and there's something that's replacing everything. So this ability to master information quickly is absolutely essential. So he's working on a whole suite of tools to help people become more agile in their approach to mastering learning and providing data to the company to help them identify people who are best prepared to take on new challenging assignments. And then many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Josh Bersin and the work he does in kind of trends in our field. And he's talking about the whole idea of learning in the flow of work, where what we thought of as training historically, where people convene or go online to learn things distinct from their work, that more and more it's all going to become fully embedded in the work, and there won't be these distinct activities. So here's the way he looks at it. From 1998 to 2020, you probably can't read all that. You can access his paper, which has the title, Learning in the Flow of Work. The important thing is that he sees many of the distinct learning activities that have been key for the past 20 years just dissipating and everything becoming embedded into the actual work process. And I think it's just a fascinating idea. So, I mentioned a little bit about my background. I mentioned the presumption that got me into the field, that if we could design training more effectively, get it into people's heads more efficiently, there'd be a direct, measurable, and important impact on the way work got done. When I had finished my PhD, I was consulting with the nuclear industry. I mentioned I lived in Annapolis. Part of that is because one of the companies I was working with back then was called Baltimore Gas and Electric. Now, of course, it's Constellation. Well, it was Constellation. Now it's Exelon. Whatever it is today. It's Thursday. I think it's Exelon. And I was recruited to go down there and be on staff. Moved to Annapolis and never left. Back then, when I was doing this, I could make it from where I live in Annapolis to the plant in 45 minutes. There was one traffic light in Prince Frederick, Maryland. Now it's probably a 90-minute commute, but fortunately, I haven't worked there in a long time. So, why were they hiring people like me? Well, there had been something that happened about, 90 miles from here, called 3 Mile Island. That was a very small technical problem, magnified many times over by human error, right? If the initial response to the situation had been accurate, none of us would know 3 Mile Island existed, okay? But that's not what happened. So what happened was there was a rush on the part of the NRC to start to think about how do we regulate the industry even further for the safety of all involved. And there was a decision to basically retrain everyone in every power plant across the country. Now, I'm going to use this as an illustration. Concurrently, the industry established the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations. It was an industry effort to solve the same problem. They established some of the most rigorous accreditation standards I've ever seen for training in any organization. So the plants responded to avoid what they perceived could be negative regulatory guidance, just the highest level of sponsorship to get ahead of the curve. And so the sponsor for training at Calvert Cliffs was the Vice President of Nuclear Operations. For all intents and purposes, we had unlimited budget, resources of any kind. The workforce was about 600 people. Of those 600 people, 120 were in the training organization. I headed up a group of 20 instructional designers. And everything was being done to have a positive impact on the plant. What happened, we were the first plant to ever get through the INPO accreditation. We maintained our operating license throughout that whole period because of stellar performance. And those literally tens, if not scores of millions of dollars that were invested in training had no discernible impact on the operations or safety. It met the regulatory guidance, but had no impact on the plant. So why does that matter? It matters because when Greg and I were talking about topics, and I threw out the idea of why you don't want to have the perfect training organization, when I've seen unlimited resources invested in organizations, things don't necessarily get better. Okay? It's not how you invest, it's not what you invest, it's how you invest. It's not the amount of investment, it's the amount of improvement. And those things can get very confused. So, we're going to take a break. Did everybody get the handouts? I assume everybody got them? Good. What I'd like you to do is individually take 3 minutes, and I'll tell you when the 3 minutes are up. I'd like you individually to decide why you would want to have a perfect training organization. And then, if you had a magic wand, what would you wish for in order to have that perfect organization? At the end of the 3 minutes, I'm going to ask you at your tables to decide, to see if there's any consensus about the why and the wishes you would have to make things better. Why would you want to have a perfect training organization? And given a magic wand and 3 wishes, what would you wish for? Okay, now, at your own tables right now, see if there was agreement with either A or B, or 1 or 2, however you want to think about it. Why would you want a perfect training organization? And along with the why, is there any alignment about what you wished for? What table would like to share a common why? If you reach consensus about a why you wanted the perfect training organization, or at least some of you agreed, who would like to share something? Why do you want the perfect training organization? There you go. They wanted to teach people to do their jobs effectively and efficiently so that the business could be profitable. And obviously, some of you are in government, and there may be other metrics. So successful, profitable, whatever the appropriate metric would be. Another why from another table.
Employees' morale.
Okay, so So in addition to what was said at the first table, this table was saying it also would impact or elevate the people's morale, right? We talk a lot today about employee engagement and being capable and confident, or confident and competent is a big facet in people being engaged. Anything other than what we heard from the first two? Yes?
I was finding that in a perfect training organization, if they embrace the idea of agility and creativity, because when they're in kind of a, I don't know how I developed it, I kind of made it up, if it's a perfect organization, part of their success is going to be involving other people.
Okay.
Not just senior people.
So the idea of agility and what was the other?
Creativity.
Creativity and agility, and the idea that that can foster collaborative growth or mutual growth. Great. Now, what are some of the wishes? What would you wish for in order to get to that perfect organization? If you had the magic, yes? So the ability to create things, to get people to move forward, to get people to have agility. Okay. So they'd be some of the outcomes that you'd be looking for. Great. Any other wishes for the training organization?
Every time.
Okay. Okay. It sounds to me like your SMEs and instructors aren't on your full-time staff. Is that correct? Do you pull? Oh, they are. Okay. Oops. That was a bad assumption for me to make. So to have them be believers, committed to the fact that they're having a positive impact on the enterprise or the organization.
Well, just make them believe that ISD brings something.
Oh, thank you for that clarity. Making them believe. I have to step behind them, the speakers. Sorry about that. I'd like to come out, but anyway.
But I'm sorry,
Yes.
we have a part social science does, so.
Okay, great. So understanding what ISD does. Boy, I thought it was going to be $1 billion a year budget. Anyway, but maybe this is harder than the $1 billion a year budget, perhaps. Yes? Okay, more knowledgeable, competent instructional designers on the team. Yeah, have them come to the program. There you go. You don't even have to pay for that marketing, Greg. Well, maybe you should, but that's anyway. Yes. Ask. Yes. There's a whole issue, and we're actually going to go right there. So it's having learning or training based on business needs and not leaders' perceptions of what might help, right? So often, any of us who have been in a staff role supporting leadership, and I've worked with procurement and legal staffs and HR staffs and all kinds of staffs, they're seen as order takers, not as diagnosticians. The leader knows, am I the only one hearing feedback? Is that, yeah, I'll stay back further. You know, the leaders come to us believing they have the solution, not even needing to define the problem. And it's more how soon and how many versus are you sure that will work? And there's a great book, Dana Gaines Robinson and Jim Robinson wrote a book called Strategic Partnering, and it's how to help staffs, I'm going to go back up on the platform, how to help staffs elevate their relationship with their clients and not simply be order takers, but to engage in meaningful conversations about the business outcomes. So, but sometimes the problem's self-imposed, right? Fantastic news. E-learning completion is way up, and our latest workshops are getting brilliant feedback. But look at the charts on the wall, right? So if we take the wrong metrics to them, if we say our success is measured inappropriately, we'll reinforce the disconnect between what we're doing and what they value. So this is also from Josh Burson. First of all, I love the quote by Albert Einstein. Not all things that can be counted count. And not all things that count can be counted. Okay? The TAN is what organizations, learning organizations, are measuring today. The dark blue is what leaders would like to know. And look at this. The TAN decreases directly opposite to what the leaders want to know. Does that surprise you? So one of the problems we have is we capture and report what's easy, not necessarily what's important. It's easy to know how many people take a workshop. It's easy to capture their reaction to the workshop, but it's much harder to measure the impact on the business. And I would argue that's entirely our fault, but we'll get there in a little bit. So, I think we need to take a different perspective to what we are about. Yes?
Wouldn't you also say it's a result of the systems we use? Like if you use an LMS, you can easily tell how many people use it.
Yes.
But it doesn't say anything about business impact, which really can be pretty hard to demonstrate.
Okay. So he's saying, isn't it that an outcome of the systems we use? So if we have an LMS and it generates how many people attended a workshop or what their level 1 reaction was, they liked it a lot, hated it, walked out in the middle, whatever you have, we default to the data that's available instead of determining what data would answer the real questions and finding out ways to measure it. He also said it's kind of hard to show impact, and I would argue only if you don't plan to measure that impact from day one, and we're going to talk about that. So, systems thinking. My company name is Exemplary Performance. The book I wrote is entitled Exemplary Performance. The publisher made that decision, I didn't. We had proposed a bunch of different titles. And you're going to see that pop up throughout, and I'll explain what I mean. But we're going to move into the idea of systems thinking. So this is the exemplary performance system as defined in writing I've done. But the exemplary performance in the center, right there, is neither the company name nor the name of the book. It's what that environment is intended to enable. So that environment, that star, is created by those 6 arrows. Those 6 arrows represent the 6 influencers or buckets or categories of things that either enable or impede the performance of people in work environments. Gary Rumler wrote a book, Gary Rumler and Alan Brace wrote a book called Improving Performance. How many of you have ever seen that book? Yes, some of you. It's it's often seen as a classic book for performance consulting or performance improvement. It's kind of one of the critical books for ISPI folks. It actually was the beginning of a whole lot of the work in the area of process improvement. Gary Rumler is probably better known in the area of process improvement than he is by people like us. It's an invaluable book. I'd recommend you all get it. By the way, on the last page, I listed some resources, including this one. But if there was a single sentence in the book I'd ask you to reflect on, it's this. When you could put good people up against broken systems, the systems win almost every time. When you put good people up against broken systems, the systems win almost every time. Exceptionally high performers succeed in spite of, not because of, the work systems in which they operate. Do you believe that? Okay. And so, what I've tried to reflect in this visual is that if you can address and align these 6 sets of influences, you can create an environment where people thrive. Okay? You want to be working in the center of an aligned, well-designed, high-performance work system. The probability of that happening is almost 0. And the problem with wanting the perfect learning system is that you're going to consume so many resources and so much time of the targeted audiences, the other subsystems will suffer. If you had a perfect learning system, training system, you would consume so much time of the targeted audiences and so much resources of the organization that performance would degrade. Now, what did I say the objective was? I expect some pushback. I'm trying to challenge what you're thinking, okay? Because there's a basic premise of systems theory. When you optimize a subsystem, you suboptimize the system. Let me back up. If you pour everything, pick any of the 6 arrows, if you pour all possible resources that you can get into any one of the 6 arrows, people will perform at a lower level. It's only when you have an integrated work system, I'll back up one further, it doesn't mean the budgets are the same, doesn't mean the head count's the same, it means they're aligned, collaborative, and supporting a high-performing workforce. I don't know if you're all asleep or if quiet's a good thing. That's all right. So, I think this is critical. Realize you want to be part of a high-performing work system, not a perfect training organization. So, I've kind of defined these influences. Well, no, I didn't. I'm sorry. I'm going to back up just for a second. Capacity and job fit. It's having the right people with the right potential in the right slots at the right time. Skills and knowledge. It's those people having the requisite information, skills, and knowledge to perform the role. Motivation and preferences over here. Those people have the right traits and aspirations to want to do well in the role. Rewards, recognition, and consequences. Have any of you ever taken a job where the job description said this, the training said that, and the rewards and recognition came from over here? That was a horrible question. Have any of you been in a position where that wasn't true? That's a better question, okay? Oops, sorry. Expectations and feedback, clarity about role, how you're going to be measured, the appropriate coaching at the appropriate time, which is not the annual performance appraisal. Jim?
Where does the transfer of training fit in here, actually applying it to your work?
Yes. So I'm going to hold the right to defer because we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a little bit. Environment, systems, and resources. Hey, that's the process. That's the physical plant in which you operate. I've been in this beautiful, beautiful new contact center. We used to call them call centers. And glass everywhere, lush landscaping outside the building. And everybody had manila folders up along the side of the screens where so much light was pouring in through the windows, they couldn't see the screens. I mean, we just do really stupid things. So we want to get those things aligned. We want to create that environment where people can thrive, be engaged, exceed expectations. So those influences are put in place by the organization to enable people to do the right stuff. Ideally, to produce accomplishments or outcomes that are aligned with the goals of the enterprise. Make sense? Performance unfolds left to right. Often the organization builds things left to right. The two left columns are costs to the enterprise. Putting in a compensation system, training people, having management to provide feedback, and then we pay people to do stuff. And there's no value in people doing stuff. There's only value when the people's doing stuff produces results. I happen to like the word accomplishments that drive the business forward. So, in the work I do and others like me, everything works right to left. What's the business strategy? What are the business metrics that mean success? What outcomes, or again, my preferred word, accomplishments are required? And that's where things start to change, because when we know what the accomplishments are, we don't look for subject matter experts, we look for accomplished performers. Now, SMEs may be accomplished performers, and accomplished performers may be SMEs, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Subject matter experts know a lot about the why. Accomplished performers consistently produce exceptional results. Once we have those accomplished performers, we then, through observation and case-based analysis, capture how they consistently produce those outcomes. And then we build the influences from that data, including training. Now, thing came up, it's hard to link our training, which is happening there, and the behaviors of people to the goals of the business. And that's hard. And so most of us have heard either Jack and Patty Phillips in levels 1 through 5 or the Kirkpatricks in levels 1 through 4. We think level 4 is a challenge. It only is if we leave out that third step. In other words, if we design everything to lead to outputs that matter, not behaviors that may contribute to outputs, by definition, you have level 4 metrics. Okay? So again, do everything from right to left. You'd think the first one's easy. Meet with the stakeholders, the leadership, figure out what the goals of the organization is. Trust me, that can be the hardest part, to get agreement between 6 to 10 leaders on what matters to the organization can really, really be a challenge. Identifying the accomplishments that support those strategies and business goals is much easier. And getting consensus on who the accomplished performers are can also be a challenge. But this is what I find all the time. Greg mentioned a whole bunch of companies that I've worked with, and it's universally true, their work systems are deeply broken. Each of those hours tends to be owned by a different group. Some of them may all be owned by, 2 or 3 of them may be owned by HR, but totally different groups in HR. How are they judging their own work? Against professional standards, not against business outcomes. There's no agreement on how to make this system work, by and large. And that's why we have so many people in so many work environments who are beaten down physiologically, psychologically, emotionally. I mean, we put people out there and they're not sure what matters. I had a friend who used to work for the state of Maryland, and he was in an economic development role. And he was at a big, physically large plant up in the city of Baltimore. And he was meeting with the plant manager. They were talking about how to help his business. That was his role. And they were wrapped up, and he was walking across the plant floor with the plant manager. And the plant manager, give me a second. Jim, it's his last day. He's been here 30 years. And they had his lunch today, and I wasn't there. I'd like to go over and say so long. So my friend went along with them to talk with Jim, and the plant manager said, we've really valued your service. There's only a couple hours left in the day. What would you like to do? He said, I'd like to tour the plant. He had never understood how what he was producing in this little corner fit into anything else that was going on. And he said, no way. Trust me. Trust me. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. So this is the way it's operating, and those of us in training want to have our perfect training organization. And if I asked you, we're not going to take the time, if you could write down the names of the people who led the other 5 arrows and how often you met with them, some of you would be stumped. Is that fair? So, we want to design for high performance. It has to be directly tied to the business strategy and metrics. It has to be based on accomplishments and not just behaviors. Just a quick illustration on that. When I showed the arrows unfolding left to right, people sometimes say, well, how do the behaviors vary from accomplishments? It's a gorgeous day out there, but let's pretend it's a torrential downpour. And when you leave here, you have a blowout 3 miles down the road, and you call up AAA or somebody to come out and help you. And it's cats and dogs. It's just awful. And the person shows up, and she gets out the jack. She jacks up the car. She takes the tire off. She says, it's time for my dinner break. Would you pay me for half the fee, and I'll come back after dinner and complete it? Now, have behaviors been completed? She got the jack out. She got the weight off the tire. She removed the tire. There's work done. What hasn't happened yet? You haven't derived any value. What's the accomplishment? An operating vehicle, right? And until you have that, there's no value. So we have to focus on what the accomplishments are that drive the business. Unfortunately, it's rare and difficult to sustain, not because of people, but because of the way we structure the work systems. And it generally occurs in spite of, not because of, the design of work systems. I have the best job in the world. I spend my life across industries working with exceptionally high performers, trying to figure out how they do what they do, how do they produce such consistently high results. And I've been around the world and across 20 industries and probably with 30 of the Fortune 100 companies at some point in my career. And the high performers in general see managers about 30% of the time helpful, 70% of the time neutral or an impediment to their own success. And they're succeeding in spite of, not because of. So just imagine what it would be like if every member of your team was as successful as they intended to be the day they were hired. Most people don't join your organizations hoping to be failures. They don't. How many show up the first day of work dragging their feet saying, how did I get myself in? I'll stop there. But 90 days later, those same people are coming in, feet dragging, chin on the chest, saying, what a mess. And we say, there's something wrong with them. Suppose they could be as successful as they intended to be the day they were hired. That your organization was barrier-free. Now, we immediately think of ADA, and that's absolutely critical, and that's part of this. But it's not just having a work environment that is accessible to people with disabilities. It's a work environment that doesn't keep you from getting your work done. That everybody understood the worth of the work. On their 30th year, they say, you don't want them to say, could I tour the plant? You know, I don't know what I've been doing matters. I don't know why what I've been doing matters. How do you expect engagement? So what would that do for your customers, for your organization, and for the employees? And I forget who raised the issue of employee engagement, right? But you can't have engaged employees if they don't know what they're about. So here's a quick case study. It's from Maryland. We were engaged with this plant. It was a greenfield. We were there. They had just started to place the steel. So it was very early in the process. The client wanted to incorporate the best practices in human performance and work design. Along with the team I was part of, there was a socio-tech expert. You don't even hear about that anymore, but at the time it was really fascinating. Basically, work design and sociology combined in a single role. And it was going to address the plant, the operators, the skilled tradespeople, even the office. We did the whole thing from soup to nuts. And we stayed with the project through startup. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Basically, the whole physical plant was designed so that people would know who their customer was and what the metrics were of success. So it was a liquid product. Retail customers wanted the bottles always filled to the same level and the labels on vertically, horizontally, whatever it is, okay? The retailers wanted the boxes that wouldn't crush, and they had their own set of standards. So the plant was laid out so you knew which customer base you were serving. And the customer sat metrics were visibly displayed on screens all around the plant, so you knew how you were doing. We designed the job so that the work was closely tied to the business metrics. We knew the impacts upstream and downstream, and all the key metrics were established and linked to customer satisfaction throughout the whole process. Again, I'm just going to go quickly. Training design. Everything was role specific, and you notice the paren, not competency based. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Everything was accomplishment based, and some of you may have heard the name Joe Harless. He was my mentor, and he had this very rigorous and rich model for designing training. Lots of structured on-the-job training. I do want to focus on the word structured. In the US, most OJT is sit by Sally, sit by Sam, hope that through osmosis, information from one person leaks over to the other. Rigorous apprenticeship programs are totally different, and that's what I mean by structured OJT. And the coaches in the structured OJT process, it was part of the career path. There was rigorous training for them. The results was the smoothest startup in company history. About 5 years after we were done, I was at BWI. This guy walked up to me, to be honest, I didn't remember him. He said, "You're Paul Elliot?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I was the plant manager at the plant." I said, "Oh," then you're embarrassed, but then you suddenly remember. He said, "We never had an experience like this plant. It was the smoothest startup we've ever had. It exceeded all of our production metrics. And employee satisfaction and retention were exceptional." So, what's the opportunity in all this? Well, I talked about the difference between accomplished performers and subject matter experts. This looks like a normal distribution. It's intended to be one. Percentage of the workforce on the left, on the vertical, level of performance, not skills, knowledge, but performance on the horizontal axis. The ability to produce results to standard. Okay? Obviously, there's a distribution, and let me hit the right button. These are the accomplished performers. They're the top 5% of people. The gaps we see between solid performers here and what's possible over there are astounding. I've never seen it be less than a 30% delta. In software development, they talk about the 10x factor. Your best coders are producing 10 times the code of what's expected. 3 or 4 years ago, I did a project with a global private bank, one of the 2 largest banks in the world. The standard for financial advisors in terms of assets under management was $320 million of assets under management for a private banker. To be in the pool that we dealt with, it was 620, just not quite double. And Charlie Hoffman over in London was at $3 billion of assets under management, almost a 10-fold increase. And we just think that's the way it is. We think this happens because of talent. But what we want to do is learn from those accomplished performers, narrow the variability and shift it to the right, because that's value. That's value. You haven't increased the workforce, you've increased the results by 10 to 15 to 20%. So, 2 truths: we totally underestimate the difference between good performers and great performers. You'll notice I'm not talking about poor performers. This is between good and great. And then we don't, because we underestimate that, we don't leverage that as a source of dramatic improvement for our organizations. So, fact or myth? Talent is the key differentiator. This is going to become an exercise in just a second. IQ makes all the difference. Hard work makes up for any difference in talent. Experience separates the great from the average. If you turn to page 4, try and decide what you believe to be the differentiators between good and great. And then what role do competencies play in this? And a little thought provoker, what's the relationship between competencies and competence? What's the relationship between competencies and competence? So what's the key differentiator between good and great? Talent? Okay. True grit. We'll talk about more of this in a second. First of all, up until 2 months ago, my model of talent was perhaps similar to most of yours. It was like innate at birth. And the role of people like us in the room was to help people use the talent they had. Does that make sense? It was a capacity that most people didn't optimize, so you wanted them to use all their talent. One of the books on the list is Peak by Anders Ericsson. It was like a 2x4 against the side of my head. He's the world expert in expertise, but he's a researcher, not a practitioner. I'm just a practitioner. And the evidence is overwhelming that talents, with the appropriate interventions, talent expands. It isn't obtained. Think about that. With the right interventions, talent expands. It's not a fixed capacity that you master. Okay? And of course, there's the classic work. London taxi cab drivers, up until Uber, had to know every street in the city to get their license. And as they did autopsies on deceased ones, fortunately, they would find that part of the brain was physically larger and different than anybody else's. So my whole model of talent was blown away by Peak, by Anders Ericsson. There's a lot of things in there. My belief about competencies was reinforced by the same book. People don't get better by mastering competencies. I'd say the data is overwhelming, but the problem is there is no data. Okay? Doesn't mean you shouldn't have competencies, but you only get better when you practice the actual performance. It has to be role specific. The examples and practices have to be role specific. If you put people from 20 groups into a single course, call it communications, my estimate is 17 of the 20 will never apply anything in that course. Jim?
Help me understand.
First of all, it's a really good way to think about it. The competencies can be derived right to left, and can and should be, but if they're practiced as discrete skills out of the context of the work, they do not transfer for 85% of the people. Now, understand what I just said. It's not that they don't need the competencies, but they don't become competent. Because the way people, we don't use the words the same way. We don't say someone's competent because they've mastered competencies. We say somebody's competent because they consistently produce the desired results. A competent football player doesn't know just how to run a 40-yard dash. He knows how to play the game. Does he need to run a fast 40? Absolutely. But practicing discrete skills out of context does not lead to competence. And I'm using, so I'm not quite, I agree with everything you said, but I'm not quite distinguishing competence from producing accomplishments. For me, a competent person produces the desired results at a consistently high level. So, turns out these are all myths. I could tell you all the reasons why. Hard work makes up for any shortfall. How many of you know busy people who are not productive? Do they say they're working hard? Yeah, okay. Experience separates the great from the average. In a sense, experience is a kind of practice. What do we say? Practice makes perfect. Dead wrong. Practice makes permanent. Perfect practice makes perfect. And if you, this is a whole nother night, but if you read Peak, the way people become experts is through perfect practice. Experts every day get up looking for an incremental way to make themselves better. They get feedback on that. It's intentional and it's incremental. Deliberate practice. It's what separates good from great. Not talent, not IQ, not experience. Okay. Another great book, I'm not going to go down the list, Jeff Colvin. He's the executive editor of Fortune magazine. Wrote a book, Talent is Overrated. It blows a lot of our thinking out of the water about talent. There's a very low correlation between talent and high performance. It's not zero. Now, I'm not saying you don't need talent to be a high performer. I'm just saying having talent does not make you a high performer. So, we work under the assumption that people come into our organization under some kind of a distribution, the level of talent, and most of us assume the same distribution will happen on the other side, and it's just overwhelmingly true based on data that people starting out here can end up over here, and people, that invisible guy, gal right there, can be an invisible gal right over there. It just isn't high correlation. And some of you are looking questioningly, and that's fine, but read Peak, read Talent is Overrated. Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers, right? 10,000 hours to get great. That's really taken from Anders Ericsson's work, and it's inaccurate. It takes 10,000 hours if there's a high psychomotor component to it, a violinist, an athlete, a vocalist. But for most of us, it doesn't take near that much amount of time to become expert, but it does take deliberate practice. I'm going to skip over some things. Oops, not that one. So, when we think of those 6 arrows, which of those contribute most to the delta between good and great? Is it training? Right there. Is it how we hire people and assign them to roles after they're hired? Is it compensation and recognition? Well, there's the truth. Hundreds of studies. By the way, a disclaimer, this is not for new hires. For new hires, those of us in the room have a tremendous impact on their performance. But for incumbents in role, people who've been at it for some period of time, the difference, the delta between good and great across literally hundreds of studies over 20 years, it's those 3 influencers at the top. The work environment, this is really management, setting expectations, holding people accountable. Rewards and recognition. Now what that shows is that 75% of the variance for people in role, again, not new hires, is due to contributors outside of their own control. Only 25% is controlled by the individual. So if not for new hires, we've got to train new hires. But when there's a gap in performance for experienced people, right now, if we're working independent of the other 5 arrows, we have some influence on 25% of the gap. Okay. I'm going to skip through some things just because of time. So once we have the data, once we've done the case-based analysis, I'd like to focus on how we can leverage that to really impact the quality of our training, to ensure that we're having measurable impact on the enterprises of which we're a part. So the same data captured from accomplished performers can influence all 6 arrows, but we're only going to look at the skills and knowledge arrow. So what are the characteristics of an ideal training asset? Well, first of all, has to be relevant to the people, right? That requires role-specific practice and examples. So if you do need to bring people into a common course around a common skill used by multiple roles, at least give them practice that's role-specific. Whether you have all the accountants sit at one table and the procurement people sit at another table, I mean, there's lots of ways you can do it. If it's e-learning, when they sign in, you know what role they're in. But give them practices and examples that are role-specific. Make sure there's sufficient practice. We have this absurd idea. We put people through training once and we expect their behavior to change. Change comes with rehearsal, or what we call practice. Performance support when appropriate. We'll talk more about that. Adequate simulation at the highest practical level. So you're doing the real work in as close to a real work setting as possible. Now, that doesn't mean all this takes longer. It can take shorter. Because the purple, the upper and lower limit, are what's required to produce the accomplishment. We train people to do lots of stuff that are above and below that line, and we give them even more stuff to know that are above and below that line that will not help them produce the accomplishment. So when you've worked right to left, you can be much leaner in your training. Might this stuff up here be fun? Yeah, what do we call it? It's the nice to know. Let them get it on their own time. And here's a simple thing. Have any of you ever had the opportunity to take the job aids workshop? Smitty, I guess you probably have at some point.
Not the specific workshop, but of course it was in the other 3 workshops.
Yes, yeah, right. No, exactly, yes. So, I went back, in the very beginning I said, I had this perception that if we got information into people's heads better, faster, more efficiently, performance would immediately go up. Long ago got dissuaded from that, and the most revolutionary 2 days of my life were going to a job aids workshop a long time ago when Joe Harless was still alive. I'm going to give you the answer to what was going to be a question, but we're coming out of time. Is a job aid required by regulation or policy? Yes, then what do? You job aid. No. Are there reasons for not job aiding? Yes. Can we get around that and get back over to a job aid? Is the frequency of the task high? Yes. Well, if it's high, there still may be reasons to job aid. So the default of the logic to whether to train the memory or produce performance support, the default is performance support. Please understand, never train something for somebody, to somebody, without using this decision logic. In the whole medical field, I'm forgetting the guy's name, Job Aid Manifesto, guy from, yes, thank you, right? But it's true everywhere. It's true everywhere. We put information in people's heads that should never reside there. So let me just give you a couple examples. Job aid required by regulation or policy, pre-flight checklist. They do it frequently. The average flight crew takes off and hopefully lands the same number of times every day, 5 to 7 times a day. Do they know it from memory? Yes. What would you do if you see a flight crew doing the pre-flight from memory? You're getting on the plane. What would you do? I know what I would do. Turn around and walk back off. Because there's no margin for error, right? That's why they become so popular in medicine. But suppose it's frequent, but it's high complexity or high change. That is, whatever you want them to do is changing every month. You can't retrain them every month. Job aided. So the default is use performance support, only train the memory when necessary. Doesn't mean you won't have a lot to train the memory. It's just use this logic before you do it. On the left, the structure of a role. Sales rep. Typically, you're going to see 4 to 6 major accomplishments for a role. Under that, a bunch of tasks. Under that, steps. How do you design the curriculum to look like the work? The curriculum is how to be competent in the role. The courses are on how to produce the accomplishments. The modules are on how to do the tasks. Where does a competency get taught? In the module where it's going to be used. Transfer goes off scale. It's a way of simulating the work by the structure of the curriculum. What's the advantage? Relevance goes off scale, because every time you're learning something, you know how it's going to help you do the job better. Reduces time to competence by 30% or more, over hundreds of examples of cases. Reduces the development by 20 to 30%, because once you've done the analysis, you have the whole structure for the training. Makes higher levels of evaluation feasible. In that model, it's crystal clear on how to do a level 4 evaluation. Are they producing the accomplishments to standard? Oops, I took my watch off. Just very quickly, 2 examples. The same bank where I was looking at the financial advisors, we were looking at the team leads. They called them desk heads. It was a career move for the financial advisors. Their primary compensation was from maintaining their own portfolio of clients. They almost became a team lead because it was a promotion, but not really. And maybe they cared about the other people on their team. Most desk heads had teams that performed at the average. Some had multiple stars on the team. what we found was when we're identifying high-performing people across an organization, they tend to be randomly scattered. But if they cluster in one team or one part of the organization, you have a high-performing leader because she or he attracts stars or builds stars or both. Okay? So if we saw 2 or 3, the overall performance of their team was off scale compared to everybody else. So we totally redesigned the job, established new outcomes and new metrics. The dominant new outcome once we redesigned the role was high-performing direct reports. It was not assets under management. That was a logical derivative of having high-performing members on your team. Changed the compensation model so they no longer kept the majority of their portfolio. They became focused team leaders. And training was redesigned, et cetera. I'm going to stop there. Time for questions and answers. I've been going too fast. I hope it has been somewhat helpful. Greg has the deck, and if any of you would like it, he can distribute that to you. I guess that's on the book's on the last page. So if you're interested, it's currently being reprinted, but I think you can still get a few copies on Amazon. The book's there. The other books are listed in the references on the last page. There's my phone number. There's my email. Happy to talk to any of you at any time. Okay. I'll repeat questions. Anybody have any questions? That's been a lot of information. Yes? Yes?
Have you seen those kind of superstars in a company where you're able to reproduce them?
Yes. So I've been working with Microsoft for 20 years, shifting, and we iterate on the same role because about every 18 to 24 months, there'll have been an incremental change, plus there will be a change in strategy. Or maybe job redesign. So we're iterating all the time, but yes, you can see a measurable impact in elevating. So let me give you one quick example. Working with Hilton Hotels, they have something called a revenue management center. Large properties have a revenue manager on site. A Hilton Garden Inn or a Hampton Inn can use this shared resource. The people there are typically MBAs or actuarial science. They're looking at all the data around the hotel and helping the hotel set rates for the rooms. Okay, so basically just like you call up the airline. Today it's one rate, tomorrow it's another rate. Same thing with hotels, right? It turns out that the quality of the analysis was consistent. They had really good analysts. The use by the hotels was totally variable. Okay? And it turns out it all depended on how the revenue manager related to her or his properties on the telephone, how they communicated the information, et cetera, et cetera. Once they redesigned the job, they had never trained for that, they had never hired for that. The consumption of the data went way up and revenue for the properties followed. Just a quick example. Those conversations tend to happen at the sponsor level, not at the individual team level. So one of the really fun things about exceptionally high performers, they tend to be very transparent. They're totally confident. They don't hold back on anything. It's amazing. But they would this may seem strange, they don't tend to talk about themselves in extremely elevated terms. They talk about their work. But at the management level, you will see those kinds of conversations going on. And, you know, that we're going to shift some of the resources from the recognition area over to compensation or something, you know. Less bonus, more salary. That wasn't a great example, but any other questions? Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to point out is that maybe even a consideration we have to do in our field is to define our terms.
Yes.
When you put up there those arrows, you probably got 7 different professions, all using the same general term. And I'll give you an example. In fact,
Yes.
I've shared it with some of the folks here. When I use the word behavioral objectives,
Yes.
my customer said to me, "You're saying we're misbehaving." Okay? Because to them, behavior is being, you know,
Yes.
perhaps being funny or being
Yeah.
distracting. To us, behavioral has to do with performance.
Yes.
So I think one of the problems we have in our field is we use it in our own terminology. They don't know what you're talking about. And by the way, the ISD model is an engineering model. It's not an education model. So I worked for IBM, and when I explained it in terms of an engineering model, because they think we are a soft science, they're a hard science, and there's no connection.
Yes.
So all I'm really getting at is make it very, very clear to them what it is you're saying, not imagining in your brain and thinking they're seeing it in theirs.
Same way.
Yeah.
Great, great point.
So my question is, in terms of developing high performance within ISD,
Yes.
what is the best way to go about doing that? Because all of us in this room are actually helping to produce high performers, but not necessarily understanding how to become high performers ourselves. So what would be your suggestions around that?
Okay. So it's not coming up with a better theoretical model, although that may be useful. It would be looking at, over the past 12 months, 18 months, which projects were the most successful in terms of the metrics you were trying to drive. And then do case-based analysis. How did it come into the organization? How was the team established? Who built the plan? And build a model of what worked to produce the outcomes that were desired. So really, case-based analysis of successes is the best way to look for opportunities for improvement. Well, thank you. It's been fun. I covered a lot of information. Feel free to come up afterwards if you have any additional questions.
Paul, thank you very much. You really, presented a good perspective that I think I know that I don't always look at. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming this evening. We'll hope to see you next time. Take care.